Julius Evola. 3 Aspects of the Jewish Problem. Extract from the first part. The spiritual aspect. What was peculiar to the Arya, a Sanskrit word that designates the nobleman, as a race, not only of the blood, but also and essentially, of the spirit, was an affirmative attitude towards the divine. What was hidden behind their mythological symbols taken from the bright sky was the sense of the incorporeal virility of light and of the solar glory, that is to say a victorious spiritual virility, whereby these races not only believed in the real existence of a superhumanity, of a race of immortals and of divine heroes, but also often attributed to that race a superiority and an irresistible power over the supernatural forces themselves. In relation to this, the characteristic ideal of the Arya was more royal than sacerdotal, it was more the ideal of the transfiguring affirmation than the priestly ideal of devout religious abandon, more the ethos than the pathos. Originally, the kings were its priests in the sense that they and no others were eminently recognized as being in possession of that mystical force connected not only with the fortune of their race, but also with the efficacy of the rites, conceived as real and objective operations on supernatural forces. Thus, the concept of regnum had a nature which was sacred, and even, more or less potentially, universal, from the enigmatic Indo-Aryan conception of the Chakravarti, universal master, to the Aryo-Iranic concept of the universal kingdom of the faithful of the God of light, from the solar basis of the Roman Eternitas Imperi and finally, to the mediaeval Ghibelline idea of the Sacrum Imperium, the impulse to give a universal material form to the force from above of which the Arya felt themselves to be the eminent bearers has always manifested itself in the Aryan or Aryan-like civilizations. In the second place, instead of devout and imploring servility, there was the right, conceived, let us repeat, as a pure compelling operation regarding the divine, and likewise it was to the heroes, more than to the saints, among the Arya, that the highest and the most privileged places of immortality opened up, the Nordic Valhalla, the Doric Achaean Isle of the Blessed, and the sky of Indra among Indo-Europeans from India. The conquest of immortality and of knowledge would keep its virile features. Adam, in the Semitic myth, is damned for having attempted to eat from the divine tree, whereas, in the Aryan myth, experiences of that kind appear to us as successful and rendering immortal heroes such as Hercules, Jason, Mithras, and Sigurd. If, even higher than the heroic world, the supreme Aryan ideal is the Olympian ideal of unchanging, perfect essences, removed from the lower world of destiny, bright as the sun and sidereal natures, then the Semitic gods are essentially gods that change, experience birth and passion, are year gods that, like vegetation, are subject to the law of death and rebirth. The Aryan symbol is solar, in the sense of purity that is strength and of strength that is purity. It is of a bright nature that, let us say it again, has light in itself, as opposed to the lunar feminine symbol, that is that of a nature which brightens only as it reflects and absorbs a light emanating from a center that is outside it. Finally, as regards the corresponding ethical principles, what is characteristically Aryan is the principle of freedom and personality on the one hand, of loyalty and honor on the other hand. The Aryan enjoys independence and difference, and dislikes submergence in a heterogeneous mass, which does not prevent him, however, from obeying in a virile way, acknowledging a leader and being proud to serve him according to a bond that is freely established, his nature being warlike and irreducible to any interest that can be bought and sold or in general expressed in terms of money. Bhakti, as the Aryans from India used to say, fides, as the Romans used to say, fides, as would be said again in the Middle Ages, trust and troiha, these will be the watchwords of the feudal system. If, in the Mithraic religious communities, the principle of brotherhood particularly showed traces of the virile solidarity between soldiers engaged in the same soldierly struggle, Miles referred to a Mithraic initiatic grade, then the Aryans in ancient Persia already had, and this would last until the time of Alexander, the ability to dedicate not only themselves and their deeds, but also their very thoughts to their leaders, whom they conceived of as transcendent beings. Among Aryans from India, the very system of castes in its hierarchy was not based on violence, but on a spiritual loyalty, dharma and bhakti. The solemn and strict behavior, free from mysticism and very suspicious of any abandonment of the soul, that used to be peculiar to the relationship between the civis and the pater and his gods, has the same features as the ancient Doric Achaean ritual, as the royal and dominating bearing of the Brahmana or solar caste in the early Vedic period, or of the Mazdean Atharvan. On the whole, it is a classical style of self-control and action, a love of clarity, difference and personality, an Olympian ideal of divine and heroic superhumanity, together with an ethos of loyalty and honor, that characterizes the Aryan spirit. In this way, even if briefly, the basic point of reference is given. These fundamentals of an ideal antithesis must be borne in mind. This antithesis must serve as our basis for evaluating all that historical reality and the global state of civilizations often show us in a mixed state. It would be absurd, regarding times that are not absolutely primordial, to want to try and find again the Aryan element or the Semitic element in an absolutely pure state, wherever they might be thought to be. What characterizes the spirituality of Semitic civilizations in general? The destruction of the Aryan synthesis of spirituality and virility. Among Semites, we see, on the one hand, an affirmation of the virile principle that is coarsely material, sensual, or uncouth and ferociously warlike, like in Assyria, and, on the other hand, an emasculated spirituality, a lunar and predominantly sacerdotal relation with the divine, the pathos of sin and expiation, an impure and uneasy romanticism, combined, as a sort of escapism, with a naturalistic and mathematically based contemplativeness. A few points must be clarified. Even in the most remote antiquity, the Aryans, like the Egyptians themselves, whose first civilization must be considered as a civilization of Western origin, looked upon their kings as peers of the gods. In Chaldea, however, the king was only a vicar, patesi, of the gods, conceived of as entities distinct from him, maspero. There is something yet more typical about that Semitic deviation from the level of a virile spirituality, the yearly humiliation of the kings in Babylonia. The king, dressed as a slave or as a prisoner, would confess all his faults, and it is only when, beaten by a priest representing the god, tears were brought to his eyes, that his appointments were confirmed and he could wear the royal emblems. In reality, insofar as the sense of transgression and sin, almost completely foreign to Aryans, is inborn to Semites and is reflected in a characteristic way in the Old Testament, what is typical of Semitic people in general, closely linked to the types of matriarchal civilizations, but foreign to patriarchal Aryan societies, is the pathos of the confession of sins and of their remission. This is already the complex, in a psychoanalytic sense, of the guilty conscience, which usurps a religious value and distorts the calm purity and the Olympian superiority of the Aryan aristocratic ideal. The main characteristic of Semitic Syriac and Assyrian civilizations is the predominance of feminine deities, of goddesses of life, lunar or telluric, who often have certain impure features in common with Hetaerae. The gods, on the contrary, with whom they consort as lovers, have none of the supernatural features of the great Aryan divinities of light and day. They are often natures that are subordinated to the image of the woman or divine mother. These are either passionate gods that suffer and change and are born again, or ferocious warlike divinities, hypostasis of savage muscular force or of phallic virility. Besides, in ancient Chaldea, the sacerdotal sciences, especially the astronomical ones, represent a lunar and mathematical spirit, an abstract and basically fatalistic contemplativeness, devoid of any interest in the heroic and supernatural affirmation of the personality. Remains of this Semitic spiritual component, secularized and intellectualized, have been at work among the Semites themselves in more recent times. From Maimonides and Spinoza to modern Jewish mathematicians, that is Einstein, Levi Civita and Enriquez, there is a characteristic passion for abstract thought and natural law as lifeless numbers. In fact, this can be considered as the best part of the ancient Semitic heredity.